going. Hello, this is another episode of In Conservation With. My name is David Lindo, also known as the Urban Birder. Today, my guest is Rebecca Heisman. She has a lot to say today about migration, but before we even get to that, and I'm so excited about this, by the way, I find migration as a subject such an interesting and fascinating thing to talk about. But I must say that today, In Conservation With is sponsored by Cower Sporting Optics, who bring you the what's it called again? The manufacturer of the world's renowned Promenade series of spotting scopes. And in addition to them, we have Birds, Wildlife and Nature also sponsoring. They're a tour company that strives to deliver the best of birding and wildlife watching throughout the world. So thank you very much, guys, for sponsoring In Conservation With. And for those who are unfamiliar with Rebecca, she is an outstanding ornithologist. She's just had a book come out called Flight Paths, and I've written a summary, a quote, which you're free to use in the back cover of the reprint, by the way, Rebecca. Brilliant history of migration study. That's what I thought it was. Fantastic. You're welcome. Rebecca is an award-winning science writer who lives in Walla Walla, Washington, and has worked with organizations including the Audubon Society, the American Bird Conservancy, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and the American Ornithological Society. And Flight Paths is your first book. So, Rebecca, how are you and where are you?
I'm great. And as you said, I live in Walla Walla, Washington. So Washington is in like the northwest part of the United States. And if anyone has heard of Washington, they've probably heard of Seattle, but I live at the far corner of the state from Seattle. I'm as far away from Seattle as you can be and still be in Washington state.
You know, I've heard of Walla Walla before, and it raised my eyebrows when I heard of it, and that was years ago, and I've not heard of it since. Is it a big city?
No, it's not. It's a fairly small town. Uh, I think at one point they used the name of the town in the Looney Tunes cartoons because it was so funny sounding. So if you watched Bugs Bunny cartoons when you were a kid, maybe that's where you heard Walla Walla. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. I still am a big Bugs Bunny fan. What does Walla Walla mean, just out of interest?
My understanding is it comes from a Native American word that means something like many waters because there's a lot of little creeks running through the area.
Okay, but you're not from there, are you?
I've lived here about 10 years, but I'm not originally from here, no. I grew up in Ohio,
Oh, Ohio. Yeah, I
which is
like
more in the
Ohio a
middle
lot.
part of the country.
Yeah, I've got quite a lot of friends in Ohio, so it's a good place.
Sure, that makes
Uh,
sense, I guess. There's a big lot of bird migration there.
yeah, exactly. Before we actually start talking about bird migration, let me ask you, how did you get into natural history? Did you have a spark bird? Were you born interested? Were you born with a pair of binoculars in your hands?
You know, that's a really good question. My parents were not birders. Like we go hiking and stuff sometimes, but they weren't avid birders or naturalists or anything. But they did during the winter usually put out a bird feeder in the backyard with some seeds in it. And so we'd get all the usual birds for Ohio backyard feeders like chickadees and stuff. And then one winter, a bird that I had not ever seen before turned up out there, and we had like a kind of crappy little Birds of Ohio book with pictures. And so I flipped through it and managed to figure out that the bird was a Eastern towhee, although the book said Rufous-sided towhee, which was the old name for it. And somehow I think that was what got me hooked, was seeing this strange bird that was different from all the other birds out there and then figuring out on my own what it was. And it wasn't really until I started college that I was around other people who were interested in birds and kind of got into birding. But I guess if I had to pick a spark bird, it would be the towhee.
Okay. And obviously this book's about migration, so you, I guess, have had an interest in that area of ornithology for some time.
Well, the backstory of the book is before COVID, I was working full time for the American Ornithological Society, which is the big professional organization in the States for bird scientists that like does research funding and research conferences and stuff like that. And I was their communications person. So one of the things that I did was promoting the new research that was being published in their journals. And so I was reading a lot of scientific papers, and I found that I kept getting really interested in the method sections, like how this research was carrying out, like that you could study bird migration using weather radar, you could study it using microphones to record calls, you could study it by analyzing rare hydrogen isotopes. And so I wondered kind of what the backstory was of who, figured out that all that was possible and how to do it. And so that's what ended up turning into the book after I left that job.
Okay, because I've said to you many times off backstage or whatever to quote like a stage film, anyway, I've said to you in the past that I'm really fascinated with migration, but I can't for 2 seconds start reading people's papers. I can't do it. Give me an abstract any day of the week.
Yeah, so that's where I come in, is I read all the papers and then extract the good stuff and hopefully tell it in an interesting way.
Well, why don't we start at the very beginning, actually? I want this to be a really nice introduction to the idea of migration for anyone watching this who has little or no idea of what migration and even what ornithology is about. When did humans first learn about the fact that birds were migrating? Because I've read loads of stories in Europe about people thinking that swallows migrated or actually hibernated in the mud under ponds, and
Yeah.
other birds flew to the moon and back.
Yeah, I go through all of that in the introduction to my book. So yeah, the swallows thing goes back to Aristotle in ancient Greece. So people have been noticing for, a very long time that birds appeared and disappeared with the seasons and seemed to move around. And so Aristotle had a couple theories. He thought that swallows might like hibernate in tree crevices, and then later that got turned into the thing about hibernating in the mud at the bottoms of ponds. He also thought that like birds might just turn into other birds. So like he thought that the birds that he saw in summer might then like transform magically into the different birds that he saw in winter. And some birds do change their plumage a lot between seasons, so he wasn't that crazy. And as far as for how people figured out the truth, it was pretty gradual. There was a guy, as you mentioned, his name was Charles Morton. I think it was the 17th century. The dates are going to escape me now, but who wrote a whole essay about his theory that birds migrated to the moon and back, which was pretty interesting. But definitely, as we got into like the 18th century, people were getting kind of the basic idea. Like they had noticed that birds kind of moved north in spring and south in the fall, and they didn't really know where they were going or how extensive these movements were. And then in the 1820s, kind of the first evidence of long distance migration between continents. And again, I talk about this in the book, is there was a stork that was shot in Germany, and yeah, you've heard of this, that had a spear through its neck that it had been carrying around for a while. And so they analyzed the spear and figured out that it had been made in Africa. So this bird had been speared through the neck in Africa, survived, and flown back to Germany. And so that was some of the first really concrete evidence of this long distance transcontinental migration.
So what was happening in North America at the time? Weren't ornithologists noticing stuff like that either?
Yeah, I mean, they were definitely noticing, Audubon and Alexander Wilson and those kind of big names from early American ornithology certainly knew that birds moved around with the seasons and, went north in spring, etc. But they didn't know where they were going or where they were coming from. So that took a long time to figure out. And that's basically what my book is about, is all the ways that people have come up with to kind of figure out where birds are going.
So birds like, for example, the Eskimo curlew, the fabled Eskimo curlew that used to migrate in their millions. Did people ever think about where they headed, or they were just interested in shooting them?
I mean, certainly ornithologists were thinking about it, but they didn't really have any way of knowing until some of these techniques started to be developed around kind of the beginning of the 20th century.
Okay, we'll talk about techniques in a minute, but
Yeah.
why? Let's ask a really basic question. Why do birds migrate? Why can't they just hang out in the same spot the whole time?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of people smarter than me who study this, but it isn't this isn't exactly what my book is about. But so my understanding is that it basically comes down to, it lets them sort of follow and take advantage of like pulses of resources that happen in different parts of the globe at different times. So like I live in North America. So in like northern North America, like up in Canada, in spring, there's this amazing flush of growth and like tons of caterpillars and insects. So like lots of protein that you could raise baby birds on. And so if you time it right, you can get there and like take advantage of this enormous bloom of insects to feed your babies. But then you wouldn't want to be there in winter because it gets super harsh. So then you can leave and return to the tropics where conditions are more mild year round, but you don't have this specific pulse at one time of year that creates perfect conditions for raising baby birds.
Okay. So you talk about techniques to work out where birds went. I mean, I can think of stuff in Europe, in the UK, for example, the British Trust for Ornithology. I think
Yeah.
the first to administer the ringing scheme back in the 30s, maybe even earlier,
Yeah.
which you guys call banding. So
Yes.
what was the earliest sort of work in the US in North America? Was it banding?
Yeah, banding is the first chapter of my book. It kind of goes in chronological order. So I talk about the guys in like the 19 I mostly I would have had to write a whole other book to talk about like the history of ringing in the UK because it has its whole own really cool long history there. So for that chapter, I did focus mostly on North America and I talk about the guys in kind of the 19 teens, 1920s who were kind of first figuring out how to organize banding in a way so that it could really be scientifically useful and kind of get it standardized enough that they could get data back when birds were found elsewhere.
And were they looking at what was happening in the UK, for example, or were they doing this independently?
Some of both. Yeah, they were certainly aware of what was happening in the UK and also kind of developing some of their own ideas.
And what kind of rings were they kind of putting on the birds?
Um, Not that different from what we have now. Little metal rings with, a number, like a mailing address or something stamped on it, so that if someone found it, they could, write to someone and report that they found this bird and where.
But were they also using things in the way past, I suppose, like threads, bits of thread and stuff like that? Did that?
Oh, yeah, that's the story about Audubon. So some people say that John James Audubon, who was back in the 19th century, was sort of the father of bird banding in North America because he wrote this story about tying silver threads to nestlings of, oh, I want to say it was a phoebe or something like that, some kind of flycatcher that was on the like nesting on his porch. And then when the birds returned the next spring, he like these birds with his threads returned and he was able to see them. There's actually some evidence that he was making that up because the next spring, when he says that he saw these birds return, he was actually in France. So he wasn't actually there when the birds would have come back. And Audubon had a habit of sort of embellishing his stories to make himself look impressive. So that story might be apocryphal.
Are you a fan of Audubon?
I mean, that's a complicated question. He did he I mean he was a great artist. He did a lot of great stuff. He also, I mean, he did own slaves. He was involved in, like not great things regarding Native Americans also. And he was just not very honest. He had a habit of just, like I said, just sort of making stuff up to burnish his own image. Ken Kaufman actually wrote a book. He's an American bird writer, actually wrote a book that came out this year called The Birds That Audubon Missed, that goes into all of this. So if you're interested in more about John James Audubon and what a complicated figure he was, that's a good one to go check out.
Yeah, because I know that some Audubon societies have actually decided to change their names. I think the Chicago Audubon Society is one of them, isn't it?
A lot of them, yeah. The National Audubon Society elected to keep the name Audubon, but then there's a lot of like local chapters throughout the US that have been getting rid of the Audubon name, uh, particularly motivated by the connection to that he was a slave owner. They want to make themselves, more accessible and don't want, like Black employees of Audubon have said that they don't like having to wear the name of a slave owner on their, work t-shirt. So things like that.
Yeah, well, that's a whole conversation which we've actually had elsewhere in conservation with in the past. We've had Ken Kaufman himself talking.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, he would be the person to talk to about Audubon, and because yeah, he wrote a
Yeah, he
phenomenal
was
book.
talking about the name changes, and someone else on another episode was actually talking about the anti people against the name changes.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a whole different subject. So we've got onto bird ringing or banding. So then I guess what came next was it mist netting? Because I think that was the way things went in Europe. Did they not sort of build these traps, Heligoland traps and things like that to
Yeah.
capture birds? Was that the same thing being mirrored in North America?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, I think now we associate bird banding or ringing and mist nets very closely together, but when banding first got started, mist nets weren't really in use yet. They were either capturing nestlings in their nests, or they were building these like wire traps that they baited with seeds. My understanding is that mist netting actually originated in Japan. The nets there were used to capture birds for food. And then the concept came back to the States as a result of like military personnel posted in Japan after the Second World War, like observed this and kind of brought the idea back.
Oh,
And so that's when mist netting came into use for American bird science.
okay. And do you use things like Heligoland traps? And for those who don't know what that is, it's one of those funnels, isn't it, that you force the birds to go through, wooden sort of structure, that's sort of built around bushes or over bushes basically, and they fly into this funnel and they get forced into an end bit, which is then where they're caught. Is that something that features in the US and Canada? Do you know?
I think so, yeah. I'm not hugely familiar with it, but certainly various kinds of traps like that are still in use in addition to mist nets.
Okay, so from mist nets, what came next? I mean, can you explain the evolution of the technology that's been put in place to track migrating birds?
Yeah, I mean, that would just be all the chapters of my book in order. So some of the other early things that people came up with were just listening for the flight calls of the nocturnal flight calls of birds passing overhead. So a lot of songbirds migrate at night and they make these unique calls as they're flying overhead. And so people would like listen and record what they heard and they could figure out what was passing through that way. And then eventually in, the 50s, people started making actual recordings of those calls. And now we can, put out microphones and identify them with computers. There was a really cool technique developed in the 1940s that's kind of obsolete now, but was really neat, called moon watching, where they would observe the full moon through a telescope during migration and count the silhouettes of birds passing across. And thanks to statistics, they could do some interesting stuff with that. Uh, Weather radar and radar in general kind of got its start during World War II. And then as weather radar came into use, migrating birds show up really well on weather radar. So that started getting used to look at sort of large scale migration patterns. And then we had like telemetry, all the various types of tracking devices you can put on birds, which kind of started with short range radio transmitters where people would do things like follow a migrating bird in a station wagon with an antenna sticking out of the top for like a week as it migrated across the country. And then that's moved on to things like satellite transmitters and MODIS tags, which I don't know how familiar you are with those, and like light level geolocators. And now today we have like the stable isotope analysis where you can actually analyze hydrogen isotopes in bird feathers to tell where a bird has been. We have like high volume genetic sequencing that kind of grew out of the Human Genome Project, but is now being applied to birds as well. So many different things from many branches of science.
Yeah, I'll be asking you about isotopes a bit later because I don't know what the hell that is. Uh,
Yeah.
but it's interesting because in the US, or North America, should I say, to be more correct, migration is a major thing, and I've been lucky enough to sort of be in the North American continent during May, and seeing
Yeah.
massive flocks of birds flying over and stuff. It's not quite the same here well, I'm in Spain, but in the UK, in Europe, it's not quite the same at all. It seems to be a lot weaker in terms of this spectacle. I mean, there's some places in Eastern Europe, like the Baltic states, like Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, where I've been during October even, and seen hundreds of thousands of birds just passing through, and this is a real spectacle. But as a rule, it's not really an obvious thing in Europe, apart from there, and also the raptor migrations that occur, for example, over Tarifa in southern Spain or
Yeah.
across, Eilat and places like that. Why is there? Do you know why there is a difference? Because in America, there seems to be much more going on, North America.
I don't know off the top of my head why there would be less in Europe. I'm lived in North America my whole life. I'm not super familiar with kind of the European birding scene. But even within North America, so I live in the Western US, and the western half of North of the US, well, the western half of the United States does not get anywhere near the volume of migration that the Eastern US does. Like the kind of thing that you're talking about, I would say is really much more strongly associated with like the Midwest and the East Coast. And that's just because of geography. Like these birds are kind of starting out in northern South America, and they just, just geographically, as they all fan out north, they don't really pass through the western half of the continent. So we get some migration where I live, but nothing like what you might see in Ohio or New Jersey or somewhere like that.
And the night, listening for night calls, I remember reading about stuff like people standing on top of Empire State Building,
Yeah.
with their parabolic microphones listening. We call it knock migging here, or
Oh, yeah, yeah,
migging, and it was something that I think gained popularity during lockdown, during the pandemic.
yeah,
Even myself, I was marooned, well, not marooned, but I was in under draconian sort of lockdown in Spain, and I remember taking my phone out. I had no microphones. I taking my phone out, putting it on top of the roof of the house overnight to see if I can record stuff. Um, it's a very popular thing, or it was a very popular thing, certainly in the UK, and a lot of birds were discovered moving across Britain that were never thought to have done in the past. For example, common scoters
yeah,
moving across inland Britain. Um,
yeah.
for those who don't know, common scoters are sea ducks. Um, is it a popular thing outside of the science community in North America? I mean, do rank and file birders partake in recording nocturnal migrants?
It's kind of a niche thing, but there certainly are people who are very interested in it. When I was researching the part of the book that talks about that, I got on the Facebook groups, both the NOCMIG one for Europe, and then there's an equivalent Facebook group for people in North America that also has, several thousand people in it swapping their nocturnal flight call recordings to help each other identify them. So it's a small community relative to, how many people are interested in bird watching in general, but there certainly are people in the US who are very into that.
Excuse me. There's several bird observatories in the UK, and I know in Europe there's a few as well. And I guess you have the equivalents in North America as well.
Yeah, there's bird observatories that have been going for decades and decades in North America as well.
Okay. Um, so let's talk about some technicalities again, because I'm interested. Uh, it's all very well sort of tracking them, but it's also I'm interested in how they actually, as birds, how they do it. Um,
Yeah.
what I know they each species or different types of species have different adaptations for migration, but generally speaking, what goes on when they are on the verge of migration? What are the triggers?
Yeah, I mean, so this is getting kind of outside of what I wrote the book about, but I can certainly answer it to the best of my knowledge. I mean, as far as the triggers go, I think that my impression is that that's still kind of an active area of research, but it has to do with the changing of the seasons, like day length and changes in weather and stuff like that. And then how birds prepare. I mean, a lot of birds basically completely reshape their internal physiology, like organs that they won't need while they're migrating, like atrophy down to nothing. So to reduce weight, and then they pack on a lot of fat to fuel their journey. And yeah, basically just go through a very great physical transformation and preparation for doing it. And then of course, when they get where they're going, they have to reverse that and sort of regrow their sexual organs and whatnot to get ready to actually reproduce. So it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, I just find it fascinating. I mean, you did mention in your book about the black-tailed godwits that migrate from.
Yeah, it's the bar-tailed godwits, yeah,
Oh,
that fly
black-tailed godwits,
from
yeah.
Alaska across the Pacific Ocean without stopping until they get to the region around New Zealand, which, to the best of my knowledge, is the longest known like non-stop migratory flight where they don't touch down in between, and it's pretty astounding.
So how long do they take to do it?
I think about a week or so. The only reason it's possible is that they have very and they only go this way in the fall. In spring, they kind of go up the coast of Asia to where they can make a shorter hop across to Alaska. But in the fall, there's these prevailing winds that sort of give them a head start, like blowing them out of Alaska at a high rate of speed. And that's the only way it's possible for them to make it all the way across the ocean in one go.
That's incredible, and they can be tracked the whole way, yeah.
Yeah, they've done this with satellite transmitters. They actually they don't want to put, because these birds are flying so far, they don't want to put anything on like the outside of their body that would affect their aerodynamics. So they actually create sort of little field veterinary hospitals in tents, and they are surgically implanting transmitters like inside the bird's body cavity, like on the Alaskan tundra, which birds recover very quickly. Like they really experience no ill effects from this, which is amazing. And then for as long as the batteries of the transmitters last, they can follow the birds across the ocean via satellite.
And when you say inside the bird's body cavities, you
Yeah,
talk about where I'm thinking you're talking about.
yeah, they're making an incision and putting it in there and sewing it up. Yeah,
Oh, really?
yeah.
Are these instruments expensive?
They can be. Yeah, definitely.
And
I don't know numbers off the top of my head, but certainly they have to apply. You have to have a lot of research funding to be able to afford satellite transmitters that
yeah,
can make it all the way across the Pacific with a bird.
because I'm thinking about satellite transmitters versus banding. Uh,
Yeah. Oh,
you
it's
know,
definitely more expensive than banding. Yeah.
yeah, but what I'm trying to say is that it's an age-old argument, I suppose. But does banding actually work? Do you get enough information back compared to satellite transmitters? Because, for example, the British Trust for Ornithology have been doing some really interesting work on the common cuckoo and its
Yeah.
migrations, and by sort of fitting satellite transmitters onto certain, the birds they catch, even though it's only a small number, but in the grand scheme of things, it's told us a lot about their movements. It's really informed us. Um, do you not think that maybe one day satellite tracking will sort of outdate the banding?
Well, I think banding is always going to have its place. And I guess the way I think of it, there's sort of two different categories of data that we can get from these long-term banding operations. First of all, of course, is it when you put a band on a bird and then it's either recaptured later or somewhere finds it dead with a band on it and reports it. And so you know something about where that bird ended up. That actually does not happen that often. Like the rate of return for like songbirds that get banded, like most of the time you put a band on it, it's never heard from again. So the rate of someone actually finding a banded bird and reporting it is pretty small. And we can get very interesting information from that data, but it's hard to get large amounts of data from that. But the other thing to understand about banding is these bird observatories, like you mentioned, that have been doing this like every spring, going back decades and decades and decades, putting out their nets and banding birds. Every time they record a bird, or sorry, every time they catch a bird, they're recording data on it. Like what date did they catch that bird and how much did it weigh? Was it male or female? How old was it? And so then even if that bird is never seen again, when you're doing this every year for decades, you're amassing this long-term record of like the pattern of migration through that location. And so that's actually how we know things that like in North America, at least spring migration has been shifting gradually earlier over the decades, is just from looking at these banding observatories and like say the average, day when we get the most black-throated blue warblers or whatever in spring has like shifted forward 2 days in the last 40 years or what, I'm making these numbers up, but you get the idea. And so those long-term just records of migration, almost independent from actually putting the band on the bird, but it's still part of bird banding, are also very valuable, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So we talked about record breakers like the bar-tailed godwit, which we found
Yeah,
via the banding, sorry, by the satellite tracking.
yeah.
Um, but are there still mystery birds in North America that you don't know what's going on with? I know, for example, in Europe, there was the problem working out what Western house martins did when they left Europe. Is there a similar scenario in North America?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to. I don't have a good example that I can think of off the top of my head of a bird where we don't know a whole lot about where it goes. I'm sure there are some. And a lot of research that's going on now too is trying to get down more to the population level. Like within a species, do different populations kind of go to different wintering locations, or do they all kind of mix together on their wintering grounds? Is another question that people are trying to answer now that we really don't know a lot about. Or like even if we know where they go, we might not know what route they take and what stopover sites are important along the way. So things like that.
And what about the migrations of seabirds? I guess that's even more difficult to track, or not?
Yeah, I almost feel like seabirding is like, and seabird scientists and stuff is almost its own world separate from a lot of the rest of ornithology. It's really interesting. Yeah, because seabirds, of course, travel very long distances, not just migrating in the same way that land birds do, but also just, foraging over vast areas of ocean. So that's a whole other question that we're still working on, definitely.
Okay. Excuse me. We talked, or you talked even about another aspect of this tracking, which is to do with isotopes. Can you talk to me as if I've never, I know nothing about anything. What the hell is it?
Yeah, I will do my best. This is probably the most challenging chapter of the book to write because it's very technical. And I'm going to start with North America just because I'm a little more familiar with that and it's a little more clear and easy to explain for North America. And it was first developed here. So everyone knows what hydrogen is. It's a basic element and it's found in water. And most hydrogen has, I hope I'm remembering this correctly and I don't mess it up, has a proton and no neutrons in its nucleus. I'm gonna mess this up, and someone watching is gonna jump in to correct me. So but that's
I
normal
think you're
hydrogen.
right. I did look it up.
Yeah.
One
Okay.
proton, one proton. You're
One
right.
one proton and no neutrons, and then a very small percentage of naturally occurring hydrogen atoms do have a neutron, and so they are slightly heavier than regular hydrogen, and so this is what we call deuterium, and they're not radioactive or anything. They're just different, and so there's just a small number of them out there, just naturally occurring, just like someone being born with an extra toe or something. They're just there, and the amount of deuterium that is just in the environment, in water, varies from place to place across the landscape. And so in North America, there's more of it kind of in southern North America, and then less and less and less of it as you go north. And this is because as moisture kind of sweeps inland from the ocean, the heavier stuff is going to fall out first in the rain. So deuterium is a little heavier, so it falls out in the rain first, and then the further like north you go, the less of it there is. So there's this gradient across the continent in terms of how much deuterium is just around. And so birds, this is reversed in Eurasia and Africa, but birds that fly back and forth between North and South America, they typically do their annual molt and regrow their feathers while they're in North America. And so they drop their feathers, they're growing new feathers. And so wherever they are as they're growing their feathers, they're eating, they're drinking, they're taking stuff in from the environment. And so however much deuterium is in the environment there, that's how much deuterium ends up in their feathers. And once the feathers are grown, like they're inert, that's locked in. It's not going to change because it's not like living tissue. It's like our hair or something. And so then when the bird migrates off to somewhere else in Central or South America, you can catch this bird and pluck a feather and run it through a big machine in a chemistry lab to see how much deuterium is in that feather. And then that will tell you approximately where the bird was when it grew that feather. And so you can figure out where it spent the breeding season. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So, but it's not accurate though, is it? It's roughly, isn't it?
It's not,
You can't see,
it's not
you can't put it to a
pinpoint
location.
accuracy. It's not pinpoint accuracy, but you can get accurate enough for it to be useful. And you can combine hydrogen with other elements also that have these what are called like rare stable isotopes. Like people also look at sulfur and carbon and stuff like that that also kind of vary across the landscape. And so you can put together like the guy who invented all of this called it like isoscape maps of like concentrations of these different isotopes across the landscapes. And then you can analyze them in the feather and figure out where that feather was grown. And then the birds that migrate between Europe and Africa typically molt and regrow their feathers in Africa, so on the wintering grounds instead. And so then you can pluck a feather off of a bird in Europe. And Africa doesn't have this nice deuterium gradient like North America does, but again, they've done work incorporating carbon and other elements as well to kind of come up with these isotope maps. So then you can analyze a feather from a bird in Europe and figure out roughly where in Africa it might have spent the winter, just based on isotopes.
And I know you may not have the answer to this, but why is Africa different to South America or to Southern North?
Oh, I have no idea why that's reversed, but where and in what season they do their molt. I don't know. That's a really good question.
Yeah, because I ask a lot of why questions. In fact, I was hanging out with a bunch of ornithologists in Dominican Republic in July, eminent ornithologists. If I mention their names, you probably know them. So I was spending most of my time on my knees bowing. But one of the most eminent ones turned around to me and said, "You haven't got the paperwork, you haven't been to university or anything like that, but you are an honorary ornithologist because you ask a lot of why questions."
Yeah, yeah, and some people get really into molt, so that maybe there is someone out there who knows why, America, north to South America migrants and Europe to Africa migrants are reversed in terms of when in their annual cycle they molt, but I don't actually know.
So does that mean that if an American, for example, a great example I told you about today, actually,
Yeah.
for those watching in conservation with, by the way, if you're watching this and enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. But anyway, for those watching, I was telling Rebecca before we started that I, in Spain, found a pair of ringneck ducks, which
Yeah.
are North American birds, and I was delighted. But what I should have done was caught them, grabbed the feather to work out their isotope and work out
Yeah.
exactly where they molted.
Yeah. Yeah, in theory that is possible. If someone has kind of done the legwork to create the isotope map for the appropriate region, then yeah.
But I'm in praise of amateur ornithologists, and you mentioned one of my one of the poster guys or poster people for amateur ornithology, and that's David Lack, the man that,
Yeah.
for those who are familiar, he opened the door to the behavioural sort of patterns of the European robin, back in the, was it the 50s? I can't remember. Um, Maybe just after the
Something like that. Yeah.
Second World War. Did you know, by the way, that the book was reissued about 9 years ago, and I wrote a forward.
Oh, wow. No, I didn't know that. And yeah, see why I know David Lack is because he was also involved in figuring out that birds were showing up on military radar during World War II, which was sort of the beginning of radar ornithology.
Yeah, well, he's a bit of a hero because he's a man that's from the street almost, who also made some very good and interesting scientific discoveries. Now, you are you are a scientist, aren't you? Really, you're an ornithologist.
I would not call myself a scientist. I don't have a graduate degree in science. I am a freelance science writer slash science journalist.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So
I've I've never been a professional ornithologist.
you could have fooled me. What advice would you give someone who wants to follow in your steps?
Um, don't. No, what I mean is when I was in college, like an undergraduate, like in university, at that point I did kind of want to be an ornithologist. And at some point, luckily before I started a PhD program, I kind of figured out that I liked writing about and talking about other people's research much more than I liked having to be in charge of my own research. So I actually worked in outdoor education for a while, like taking, kids out on hikes and teaching them about ecology and stuff, and then kind of got from there into science communication and science journalism. But I didn't know when I was an undergraduate that science writing or science journalism was a career. So if you're interested in science writing, like, you can study science writing in college, which I did not do because I didn't even know that was an option. So that's what I mean. And I'm like, don't follow in my footsteps because I kind of made it up as I went along. And if you know that this is what you want to do, there's probably better ways to go about it.
Yeah,
I've
but
never, yeah, I've actually never taken a single class in writing or journalism. I'm entirely self-taught in
well,
that field.
that's for me. That's commendable, and I think those kind of journeys are much more interesting than the traditional go to college and learn how to do something the way that someone teaches you how to do. You've done it yourself. You've actually created this whole path for yourself.
Yeah.
Was there anyone that influenced you in any way, or were you totally just, "Oh, I'm just doing this and that's that"?
Oh, there's a really, he's not bird specific, but there's a really fantastic science writer who maybe you've heard of named Ed Yong, who's written, well, he won a Pulitzer Prize for covering COVID, but aside from that, he's written a couple really wonderful popular science books. His last one that came out was called An Immense World, and it's about like animal senses. It's really fantastic. I highly recommend it. And So he's been working, just in science writing and writing about animals and biology and things like that for a very long time. And so I discovered him on social media, back when Twitter was still something that was fun to use, kind of back when I was working in outdoor education. And I think discovering his work was the first time that it really dawned on me that writing about science could actually be a job. And so I guess Ed Yong, I would have to say, was an inspiration. I've never met him. I don't know him personally, but he's just a really fantastic writer who I followed for a very long time.
So how did you get your first gig?
That's a really good question. Oh, and I should add, Ed Yong is a birder now. He got into it during the pandemic, so he's become one of us. How did I get my first gig? Well, when I was working in outdoor education, this was 15 years ago when like blogging was kind of more of a popular thing than it is now. And I'd always kind of liked writing. So I decided it would be fun to start a natural history blog. And so for goodness, 5 years maybe, I had a blog that I posted to usually about 3 times a week with posts and photos of like interesting natural history stories from the places where I was living. And so I was doing that, and then when I worked on my master's degree in environmental education, my sort of project that I did for that degree was on promoting environmental education through social media. So I had some experience, like, semi-professional experience doing social media stuff. And while I was in grad school, again, for outdoor education, not for ornithology, I was living in Wisconsin and just for fun, wrote a couple magazine articles that I didn't get paid for like the State Wildlife Agency magazine, just as something to try. And then eventually I got hired originally as a part-time contract with the American Ornithological Society that I mentioned before, starting specifically part-time just to promote research coming out in their journals. And they wanted someone who could write press releases. And so I'd been, writing this blog for years and had these couple magazine articles, and then someone who could also run a Twitter account for their journals specifically. And so I could say like, hey, look, I studied social media in grad school and I had some connections in the ornithology world as well. So kind of talked my way into that and then built more of a writing and communications career from there, just kind of making it up as I went along.
That's fantastic. I love that. Rebecca, I love that. I think it's amazing. I love it because I mean, it echoes slightly my path, which was totally unconventional. I have no qualifications whatsoever in any aspect of natural history. And when it comes to influences, I mean, I remember someone asking me, "Oh, what are your influences?" Expecting me to shout out David Attenborough. And even though, yeah, of course, he is the Don, my answer was Prince and a footballer called George Best, a soccer player called George Best, which obviously shocked people when I said that. But it's more about their attitude and the fact that they were leaders and the fact that they cut their own paths. And even
Yeah,
when it comes to photography, I mean, I take pictures, but actually the photographer that really influenced me had nothing to do with natural history. His name is William Eggleston, a US photographer who took pictures in the 70s in the Midwest, taking pictures of a lampshade or the side of a car or something, but he made it look so interesting. And I think he's one of the first people to colorize photography as well. So
mm,
it's interesting the influences you get. But what I'm trying to say is it's really good that you've done what you've done because for young people watching this, especially, it's really inspiring because I speak to people who say, "Oh, I can't do that because I haven't got that exam or I haven't done it," and I'm saying, forget about that, just do it, you know.
yeah.
And you are living proof that you can actually do it, write a very good book, and know your stuff as well, which is great.
Thank you. I still feel like I don't know what I'm doing a lot of the time. So I don't know. Maybe if I had a degree in science writing, I would be more confident. But
I think imposter
yes,
syndrome
that's
is,
it.
is something that fires us on. I think it keeps us
Yes.
going. It's fuel. We use it as fuel.
Yep.
You're desperate not to be sort of, found out. So you got to keep ahead of the game.
Yep.
I'm going to ask you a question which may not be covered in the book, but I want your personal opinion on it. Again, to do with
Okay.
migration, so don't worry, it's nothing too dramatic. Excuse me. Where does vagrancy fit into migration? Because I was thinking that today
Ooh.
watching the ringneck ducks that I found, and they were sitting with common pochards, which are European essentially. And I was thinking maybe I should check the pochards in case it's a redhead, a North
Oh
American
yeah, yeah,
duck, which looks similar to a pochard.
yeah.
Was back. I knew it wasn't because it didn't have the shape of the face, but I was checking because I was thinking, did it have companions? So is vagrancy migration gone wrong? Is vagrancy something that is purely weather sort of determined, or is vagrancy a bit of all of those things, but also pioneers, birds that have decided, you know
Mm.
what, I'm going to go this way, I'm going to turn left instead of turning right.
You know, I don't know. I don't know that anyone really knows for sure because there's certainly still people actively studying this. And there are people who are much more expert on vagrancy than me. Like in the UK, there's a guy named Alexander Lees who I think has written a whole book on vagrancy who could tell you much more about this than I can.
Yeah, he's
Um,
actually been a guest as well. So,
okay, fantastic. I was figuring you probably knew who he was.
but I'm
Uh,
not actually looking, Rebecca. I'm not looking for facts. I'm looking just for your
okay,
opinion. You know, just
all
because
right.
a lot of the stuff I talk about is not often facts. It's just basically opinion. It's
Yeah,
just conjecture.
okay. My gut answer then is I think it's a mix of all the things that you said. Can I add one interesting factual thing to that though?
Please do.
There's been a couple studies in the past couple years looking at a couple data sources that vagrancy increases quite a bit following geomagnetic disturbance because birds use the Earth's magnetic compass to navigate. And so when we have a lot of, space weather, a lot of geomagnetic disturbance that can throw off their internal compass. And we did just have that big aurora event not too long ago. So maybe that's why your ringneck ducks got lost. Who knows?
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think talking about geomagnetic
Yeah.
disturbances? Do you think in the long term, things like climate change are actually affecting migration because what I've noticed and anecdotally amongst the sort of the people on the ground birding, they're noticing more and more vagrant birds these days and bigger
Hmm.
numbers of birds that are normally found further to the east. Is that coincidence? Do you think? Is it because there's more people on the ground looking? Or do you think that there is genuinely something going on? Because you've mentioned earlier that some birds are actually migrating earlier now, and
Yeah.
that's been reported here in this side of the world as well.
Yeah.
What do you think?
It might be some of both. I mean, there certainly are a lot more people going outside looking very closely at birds than there used to be. So naturally, we're going to just find more rare stuff because we're looking a lot harder. I think it also is possible, like we know that vagrancy can be connected to extreme weather, like hurricanes and stuff like that, and that's certainly increasing because of climate change. So that there could definitely be a climate change connection there as well. And although it's, scientists who study this and like do the math and statistics would tell you it's really hard to point exactly to the cause. Like we do absolutely know that the kind of the average timing of spring migration in North America and I believe in Europe as well has like gradually shifted forward over the past 50 years. So things are changing.
Okay. Do you actually go birding often yourself?
Yeah, I'm not much of a lister. I used to keep a life list. I don't really anymore, but yeah, I do go out birding pretty regularly on kind of a more casual basis.
And why don't you keep a life list anymore?
That's a really good question. I don't know. At some point, I just lost interest in keeping up with it.
Simple as that, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It wasn't, I don't know. It wasn't fun, so I stopped bothering with it. I don't know. I just like going out and seeing the birds.
Do you bird mostly in the US or do you go, are you one of those people that travel down to Costa Rica and places like that?
I've been to Costa Rica once when I was in college. That was a lot of fun. So I did go and see the macaws and the toucans and stuff. And I also, just after finishing my undergraduate degree, I got to spend 3 months in Australia in the outback as a field assistant for a PhD student and saw a lot of cool Australian birds. But that was, gosh, 15 years ago now. And I think that's the last time I've been birding outside the US and Canada. So yeah, I'm not a world traveler, not a world birder. I have a 6-year-old, so that kind of limits your world travel some.
That's true, yeah. Do you think there is much more to be discovered when it comes to migration? bird migration?
I mean, that's a really good question. I think we've got like the broad strokes pretty well filled in, and this is all just my opinion, but I think we've got the broad strokes pretty well filled in. I don't know that there's any like huge shocks that are going to completely overturn our basic understanding of migration that are coming. But I think it's one of those things where the closer you examine it, the more questions you're going to find. So like I said before, now and at least in North America, a lot of research is shifting to looking at migratory connectivity, which is like this question of if you've got different breeding populations of a bird species, are they all going to separate, distinct wintering locations, or are they all just kind of mingling around on their wintering grounds? And that can be important to understand for conservation. Like if some populations are declining and some aren't, that can help you pinpoint why. So there's a lot of this more like these more fine scale questions that we're still working on answering now.
Yeah, and I've also noticed over the last 10, 15 years more talk of organs that birds have to help them navigate. I mean, can you talk around that in terms of, I mean, I was reading about robins having some sort of organ on one side of their face somewhere that kind of can follow magnetic lines and stuff. Is that right? Like,
Yeah, well, the magnetic stuff is really cool. We've known for, decades that birds can sense magnetic fields. They've actually done experiments in laboratories with like artificially manipulating magnetic fields around birds to like see how they react. And that goes back quite a while. But the question is how, for a while that like they had found some like magnetite, like a magnetic mineral, like particles of this in like pigeons' beaks, and I thought that might be the answer. But the current theory is that it actually has to do with birds' eyes, and that they have the details of this are going to escape me because it has to do with quantum physics. Something like birds have special blue light sensitive proteins in their eyes that get excited into a different state depending on the Earth's magnetic field, like a different quantum state. It's yeah, the current theory as to how birds sense these magnetic fields is pretty out there and has to do with quantum mechanics.
yeah, you've lost me already.
Yeah, I don't even know. It's one of these things where when I read the explanation, I'm like, ah, yes, okay, I've got it. And then half an hour, like I could not explain it to you.
So you got this book that's out now. I believe there's two versions, one American or North American, and the other one is for us in Europe for some
Yes.
reason.
Would you like me to show it off now? Okay.
Yeah,
So
sure.
yes, this is the book. It's called Flight Paths. This is the North American version, and this is the UK version, but same title, Flight Paths by Rebecca Heisman, and you can find it at any, online bookseller. So, and it's all about not just migration itself, but about all these techniques we've been talking about for how people figured out migration.
The North American one looks thicker than the European. We're getting less, are we?
Yeah, I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's just a difference in text size. The North American one also has some photos that the European one, the UK one does not have, and I don't know why that's the case. I had no say over that.
And Rebecca, what's next? I know this has only just come out, but are you thinking about the next book?
It's been out for a year and a half now, actually. So I get asked all the time, am I working on a second book? I am not at this time working on a second book, but I do a lot of other freelance writing. So I just had like a feature come out in Scientific American this fall. I write for the Cornell Lab of Ornithology magazine on a regular basis, which is a big ornithology research institute in North America. So yeah, I'm basically just a full-time freelance bird writer writing for magazines and places like that. And if you go to my website, RebeccaHeisman.com, I have a monthly email newsletter where I put stuff that I'm writing and working on and other things that I find interesting. So yeah, no new book, but lots of other freelance writing about birds.
And when you wrote that book, what was your process? Did you find it easy to write?
Um, yeah, I mean, easy might be too strong of a word, but it was definitely very enjoyable. I had about a year from when I signed the contract to when I had to turn in the draft, and I was reading a lot of scientific papers. Like each chapter covers a different technique that's been developed to study bird migration. So I would start looking like what are the kind of the major studies that have been done using this technique, and then look in their like works cited section for other earlier studies that they were citing and kind of trace this chain back to kind of who first figured this out and started using it, and would make a lot of kind of organize all of these papers in chronological order and make notes on them and figure out who were the major researchers in this area that I should probably interview and kind of piece together a story from that for each chapter. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, so you found the process of writing quite it flowed. You didn't have sort of writer's block or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I hope this doesn't sound cocky. I don't really get writer's block. I mean, right, because it's just a job, right? Like even if you don't, you can't just wait for inspiration to strike. Like even if you don't feel like it, you just have to sit down and start putting words on the page, and they might be terrible, but terrible words are better than no words, and then you can go back and make them better later. So it's just a job. You just do it. Like you can't, like if you're a teacher, you can't say, "Oh, I've got teacher's block today. I can't teach." You know, it's just what I do for work. So
No, it's interesting because I too, I don't think I've ever had writer's block,
yeah.
but I got feeling that my style is different to you because, or not my style, my actual preparation and stuff is different to you because I'm Mr. Classic lastminute.com. Um, my first book, I had a year to write as well, and I wrote it all in the 11th month.
Oh, wow. See, I don't know if it was because I was a new author or what, but when I signed my contract, the first thing my publisher asked for was for me to like make a schedule for myself of when I thought I was going to complete each chapter and provide them with that schedule. And so then I was like sending them a new chapter to read over like every month for that year.
Oh,
So I
right.
was, yeah,
Yeah,
I had some accountability. I had to be working on it steadily.
I struggle with that. I don't think any publisher would take me on that basis. Okay, Rebecca, we've come to near the close of this great episode of In Conservation with. Um, One question I'd like to ask, which I tend to ask a lot of people, um, so forgive me if I'm boring you with this one, but what is your favorite? I'm going to add a little caveat. What is your favorite migratory bird?
You know, I get asked this a lot, and I told you earlier my stock answer is usually the calliope hummingbird, which is migratory. It's the smallest hummingbird in North America, and we get them in my backyard. I like them a lot. But you know what? I'm gonna change it and say the Lewis's woodpecker, which is also migratory. It's a migratory woodpecker that we have here. And I had never seen one until a few years ago, and now I've seen several because they do migrate through the area where I live. And they're very cool. They're like a pink and green woodpecker that like catches insects in the air like a flycatcher. They're a very unique, strange woodpecker, and I like them an awful lot. Lewis's woodpecker. You're
Yeah,
gonna look at them now. They're very cool.
yeah, I've actually never seen either of those species. Um, Maybe because I haven't. I mean, I have spent time, and there's a Lewis's woodpecker.
Yeah, on the lower left there.
Yeah,
Yep, they're very cool.
um, I have not spent enough time. Well, I have spent time in Western North America, but not in your end of the world. I've
Yeah.
not been up to Washington actually. And if you could be anywhere in the world, where would you be right now?
Right now, in October, that's a really good question. In New England somewhere where they get really good fall color because we don't get nice fall tree color where I live. A little bit, but not like in the Eastern US.
Okay, cool. Well, Rebecca, thank you very much for today. I just want to thank everyone, including the Zoomers who are here today, for
Yeah.
being here, and also the sponsors, Kawa, Sporting Optics, as well as Birds, Wildlife and Nature. And for those watching this live, not live, actually, you're alive, the person watching, but watching it on YouTube in the future,
Yeah.
as I say, please like and subscribe and tell all your friends about In Conservation with. But anyway, Rebecca, thank you very much. Best of luck with the book as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Until we meet again, because there's going to be some more fantastic episodes, keep looking up. Right, at this point, we will now switch over to our Q&A section. And hello, everyone. And I just wondered if anyone has a question for Rebecca. And I can see Jim has already come live. Hello, Jim, by the way. How are you?
Well, thank you, David. Nice to see you again. And thank you very much, Rebecca. It was a very interesting discussion. I
Yeah,
wondered
thank
if
you.
I wonder if you could make a comment about the direction of wind on influencing bird migration, because I've heard people say they like a headwind, or they like a tailwind, or they like a sideways wind. And I mean, I just wondered if you have a view on that, and if it varies according to species.
You know, I don't know the answer to that one. I'm sorry. That's not a subject I've done a lot of digging into. It's a good question though.
Right. I've got another question, if I could. And
Yeah.
that is about the call notes of migrating birds. Now,
Yeah.
I live on the east coast of England, and there's a lot of
Okay.
wild geese migrating now, and they're calling non-stop.
Hmm.
Why? I mean, why do they have to be doing all the time? Do you know? I mean, I always find that rather wasteful of energy.
Yeah. So I think people are still studying that, but my understanding, sort of my guess, and there's some research that supports this, is that it's social. It's part of how they kind of keep track of each other while they're in the sky and kind of urge each other to keep going. Uh, a lot of my knowledge of the nocturnal flight calls comes more from songbirds, because migrating songbirds do this as well. They make these little chirps and stuff that are different from the sounds that they make during the day. And a lot of those birds don't necessarily migrate, or we don't think of them as migrating like in a social flock the way geese do, but then they've actually found that there is a social aspect to that as well, because birds from different species or songbirds like wood warblers in North America that follow similar migratory routes tend to have similar nocturnal flight calls. So they're using it to kind of find each other and stick together and urge each other on. And I would imagine it's kind of the same for geese, that there's a social function to it that has some value for them.
Thank you. But if I hear a party of, say, whimbrel, maybe a group of 10 flying over, there's only one of them calling.
Oh,
I wonder if I mean, I assume there's only one calling, or one at a time. They're not all calling together. I just wonder, do you think there's a sort of a leader of the pack, as it were?
yeah, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. Someone should study that.
All right. And another question I have to ask, and that is, um, I live in an area where we've got quite a large flock of semi-feral barnacle geese,
Oh,
and they fly within a 5 mile radius. But normally they're migratory species, but these obviously aren't migrating. Has that urge sort of been lost with time, or what? Why don't they migrate anymore?
yeah, that can absolutely happen. Migration is, relatively plastic, meaning relatively changeable, to use the technical term for it. And populations can absolutely kind of lose the urge to migrate if they discover that they can get plenty of food in one place year round. And we have the same thing in North America with Canada geese, which at one point their populations had declined quite a bit, quite drastically. And so they started putting out, supplemental food for them, trying to help them come back. And this was so successful that now we have lots and lots of Canada geese, and a lot of them don't migrate because they figured out that they could just hang out in city parks year round and get plenty of food that way. So now we have sort of wild type migratory Canada geese, and then our city park Canada geese that hang out all year. So we have a similar thing here.
Oh, great. Just one last thing. The magnetic thing you were talking about.
Yeah.
Do you think that's in humans as well, or is that sort of vanished?
I don't think there's any evidence for it in humans. We know that birds do it. Whales and sea turtles can also sense the Earth's magnetic field. So a lot of these animals that make these very long distance journeys, whether in the sky or in the ocean, have developed this ability to sense kind of the Earth's geomagnetic field as a means of navigation. But people can't do it.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And good
Yeah.
luck. That's great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
And Jim, thank you. It looks like you've got a new internet provider, because you've got, I can hear you and see you now.
Oh, great. Well, I haven't actually. I'm just doing it on an iPad rather than a desktop. That's probably a factor.
Yeah, maybe that's the way forward then.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Dennis, you've come on, switched your light on. Hello, Dennis. Dennis, by the way, is in Eastern US.
Oh, okay.
Connecticut.
Oh, wonderful.
See, the colors are fantastic right now.
Yeah.
You don't have that many migrating species through the Western US.
Yep.
We have
It's true.
tons of them in the Eastern US and Central US. Is that because the birds are following great circles from Canada to South America, and the great circles, pretty much regardless of where they start in in the Arctic area, if they're going to South America,
Yeah.
be going through those.
So my understanding is it really just comes down to geography. Like if you take a map and you look at like where, like say Colombia in South America, and you draw a straight line from Colombia to even the Western Arctic, it's still not going to go through the Western US. Like it's just not on the route of these birds that are going from South America to the Arctic. It's just, we just get bypassed. Yeah, it's really unfortunate. We have a few migratory birds, but not like you guys in the East do.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Dennis, for your question. And I guess Dave's up next.
Hi, thanks for a very good talk, Rebecca.
Yeah.
Really interesting. The thing that struck me when you were talking about, or David spoke about climate change and differences, and I'm sure, well, there is a noticeable thing called short stopping, where birds that used to come down in the winter from the high Arctic would come down into sort of southern England, and particularly ducks. And now it seems they just don't bother coming this far. They're quite happy stopping in northern Europe. Because the winters are that much milder. Is that something you've seen in North America?
Not that I'm aware of off the top of my head, but again, I am personally not I am a birder, but not an extremely serious birder. So people who are going out and spending more time, hunting for unusual ducks and stuff might know more about that than me. But it does sound like something that could be connected to climate change, definitely.
I just thinking about my own question, actually. I suppose that we've got a difference here that coming to the United Kingdom, a lot of birds have got to cross the North Sea, which is a bit of a change. Whereas going
That
up
makes sense.
the
Yeah.
east coast of North America is you haven't got that large body of water.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, that would make a big difference.
Yeah.
Until you get to the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, but if they're coming up from South America, they've got to cross the Gulf of Mexico. But once they get across that, they're home free, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of I could be wrong. I don't think a lot of ducks go all the way to South America. I think our ducks more go between like Canada and the temperate US.
Yeah, I think most of them do, yeah. Most of them just go further south.
Yeah.
Yeah. As do the geese.
Yep.
So, yeah. Well, thank you, Dave. And I like your griffon vulture being chased by what, herring gull?
I think it's yellow leg gull.
Yeah, leg gull. Yeah, must be, because obviously it's down south, yeah.
Yeah.
Good. And Dennis, birds can't vote, but you can. What's that about?
It's an Audubon campaign to get people to vote at the upcoming election.
Oh,
So speak out for birds.
okay.
Make a wise choice in the election in 2 weeks.
Okay, well, let's hope that the right decision is come to. Okay, well, listen, thank you everyone for being here again today. I guess there's no more questions, but Rebecca, once again, thank you. And I'm looking forward, I'm meeting Rebecca in January.
Yeah.
In
We're going to be
California.
speaking at the same bird festival, so that'll be fun.
Yeah, we're going to Morro Bay Festival in California, so that's going to be exciting. So I'm looking forward to seeing you then. But
yeah,
congratulations, and thank you very much for being a guest today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was fun.
And Zoomers, again, thank you for showing up. We've got another one tomorrow night, by the way, and that's all about butterflies, rare butterflies in Britain and Ireland with Pete Eales. And he is also a big member or something high up, I can't remember actually, in the butterfly conservation world. And then on the 11th of November, Monday, the 11th of November, we have Andrew Birch and Cinti Lee, who have written a book about North American flycatchers and how to identify them. So that will be another brain twister. And on Tuesday, the 19th of November, we got Sophie A.H. Osborne, who has been doing a lot of work trying to protect and save endangered birds. So some interesting things coming up, more to be coming as well. So keep an eye out on the actual website. So guys and ladies, thank you very much. And until we meet again, keep on looking up. See you soon.
Thank you.